Welcome to Managing Self-Doubt and Uncertainty. My name is Dr. Amanda Weiss, and I am a licensed clinical psychologist who specializes in acceptance and commitment therapy, grief, traumatic loss, pet bereavement, and working with vet med and animal welfare professionals. I am also one of the facilitators for NOMV's Veterinary Mental Health Support, which is a program that provides free, professionally led peer support groups, as well as free one-on-one support sessions for veterinarians. And in addition to the VMHS, you will see here that NOMV has a whole smorgasbord of peer support, awareness, education, outreach services, as well as resources that I highly encourage you to take a look at, including NOMV's YouTube channel that has a ton of different webinars that are on, relevant mental health topics connected to the field of vet med. So the agenda for today, we're going to explore some common internal struggles in vet med that impact mental well-being, in particular self-doubt and uncertainty. I will be illuminating the function of the mind as well as some common costs. We'll also identify approaches and strategies to navigate the mind more effectively in general and as it applies to uncertainty and self-doubt. And then I'll share some information to help understand the usefulness and the application of self-compassion and the growth mindset. And so uncertainty and self-doubt are prevalent in academically demanding and high-pressure careers like vet med. And so to get started, we're going to do a little exercise. And I want you to just take a few moments and let your mind kind of share with you all of the things in your life that are currently uncertain right now. So just think about and list off all of the uncertainties present in your world right now. All right, so how did that go? How many did you come up with? Was that experience kind of easy where your mind was, dishing them out in double scoops, right? Or, was it a little bit more difficult to come up with uncertainties? And now I want you to do the same thing and thinking about, the things in your world right now that are currently in your control. And kind of just notice what that experience was like, thinking about the uncertainties and thinking about what is in your control. Because more often than not, our mind, will dish out way more, look for the things that are not certain than the things that are in our control. And so if the naming uncertainties was easier, then welcome to the human experience. And so, being a veterinarian means encountering uncertain situations, much of the time, right? From being a vet student to a practicing professional, there's a lot of gray areas where things are just not clear cut or straightforward. And at times it can feel like this never ending game of whack-a-mole, both at work and outside of work. And so uncertainties are certainly inevitable, right? And there's a misconception that, many people have that it's uncertainty that causes anxiety or is, directly, what causes it. And that's not exactly the case. It's not the uncertainty in and of itself that causes the anxiety. It's the stories that our mind makes up in the face of the unknown that are actually, contributing to anxious feelings because more often than not, those blanks that our mind fills in are stories about the worst case scenarios, right? The things that we don't want to happen or fear happening. That's the stories that our mind likes to dish out in the face of uncertainty. And that is what is contributing, to those anxiety feelings. And so, anxiety is more of a consequence of the stories that our mind tells us in the face of uncertainty than directly from uncertainty itself. And self-doubt too is something that is very common in vet med, right? As veterinarians, you are in the ocean, right? Of with many schools of fish who vary in the amount of time that they've been swimming in the ocean, the way that they were trained in their, particular ponds, and in their impressions of and approaches to certain cases and diagnoses. Right? As vets, you're also dealing with high stakes situations daily, life and death decisions that you're making. And so, understandably, self doubt may arise there. And so self doubt can look like shaking confidence, second guessing yourself, imposter syndrome, right? And imposter syndrome is, these persistent feelings of self doubt and feeling like a fraud despite evident achievements, right? It may also kind of show up as rumination or overthinking, like I like to call binge thinking, right? People with self doubt might be seeking reassurance more often, maybe avoiding things more often, as well as engaging in, more self criticism. And there's this dance that kind of comes about with imposter syndrome and perfectionism, where the imposter cycle starts with setting these impossibly high standards and then spirals into self-doubt when standards are unmet. And so successes then are usually dismissed as flukes, which then further reinforces those insecurities and self-doubt. But really, self-doubt in many ways shows that you care, right? There's a really deep and intimate connection between our pain and our values. And so if being, a competent veterinarian and providing, effective, compassionate, type of care is what's most important to you in moments where you're doubting that, it makes sense that there's more pain, right? That pain is tangible proof that this is something that's really important to you. And so intermediate levels of self-doubt, can be useful in some ways, right? It can be this antidote to being reactive or impulsive when we are pausing and thinking, something through before we act on it. However, higher levels of self-doubt can become inhibiting and impairing, right? It can lead to burnout, anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, a skewed self-perception of yourself as a veterinarian and your, capabilities and your skill, and more difficulty, helping others effectively when you are, kind of paralyzed with doubt or consumed with doubt about yourself. And so these are common and natural, experiences in vet med. And so it's essential to talk about self-doubt and uncertainty and, other feelings that come along with it, and other experiences, as well as to learn how to accept and manage these, again, very common and natural experiences. Step two, managing self-doubt and uncertainty is getting to know the mind, because that in many ways is where, self-doubt and uncertainty is born from. And so, first thing to know is that your mind is a lot like my mind and everybody else's minds, right? The things that your mind says to you is, very likely similar to the things that my mind says to me and others' minds say to them. Right. And this is something that, we in our own minds, we think, oh, I'm the only one that's going through this. But again, the way that our mind works is what we all have in common. And so growing up, we learn about our brain, what it is, how it works, how to use it. But nobody teaches us about our mind and how our mind is separate from ourselves and separate from your brain, right? We have a tendency to take thoughts as absolute truths and facts when thoughts are just thoughts, right? But we believe them so seriously or take them so seriously because we hear them in our own voice. But again, thoughts are not facts. Thoughts are words that have letters, and those letters, have syllables, and when strung together, make sounds, right? Also, what happens in the mind is something called secondary emotion processes, where we have feelings about thoughts, thoughts about thoughts, feelings about feelings, feelings about thoughts about feelings about thoughts about feelings and about thoughts. Right. And this is where, mindfulness can be particularly useful in being able to be with what is coming up naturally and not getting kind of entangled in the you know, thoughts and feelings that follow those initial thoughts and feelings. The mind is also a time traveler, right? It loves to bring us to the past or, jump ahead to the future. It is also a master storyteller, right? It loves to tell us stories. You can't do this. You should do that. You're a failure. Nobody likes you, right? And so to illuminate, the mind storytelling kind of machineness, we're going to do another little exercise. And so I invite you to have the thought and repeat the thought, I can't raise my right hand. I can't raise my right hand. And as you're repeating, I can't raise my right hand, I want you to slowly start to raise your right hand. I can't raise my right hand. I can't raise my right hand. I can't raise my right hand. I can't raise. Well, look at that. My mind was telling me the story that I can't raise my right hand, but look, my right hand's in the air, right? And so seems pretty, harmless. But if I thought I couldn't raise my right hand, then I may never try to get something from a shelf or use shelves or anything like that. And so when we believe what this storyteller is telling us, it does influence the steps and actions that we take next. The mind is also a problem solver, right? It's what it does. It solves problems, it looks for problems to be solved. And when there are no problems to be solved, it can create problems that aren't actually problems in that moment, but then become problems in terms of the way the mind dishes it out. And so the problem with the mind is its search for problems, right? Versus being able to just be in the moment, naturally with what's unfolding and not kind of on the lookout for problems all the time. But that is, one of the mind's functions. It is also a safety machine or the protector, right? And also too, going back to the problem solver, when you're noticing yourself ruminating, dwelling, self-blaming, this is your mind trying to help you learn from past events, right? It's saying you need to learn from this so you're ready and prepared and know what to do if something similar should ever happen in the future, right? So again, these functions that, our mind has, right? There's purposes to it all. And so, in terms of this safety machine protector, our brain is wired for survival. Back in the day of the cave people, it was eat or be eaten. And so it served a really helpful, useful function here. In the world, that we live in today, the stories that our mind tells us actually become the threats, right? Like, fear, threats of failure, rejection, and things like that. And so, when you notice yourself worrying, catastrophizing, predicting the worst, this is your mind trying to prepare you, to get you ready for action. It's saying, look out, bad things are likely going to happen. You might fail, you might struggle. Get ready, prepare yourself, protect yourself, right? And so, again, it's trying to help, with survival, but these threats, these dangers aren't always actually present in one's environment at that moment. The mind is also this harsh critic, right? This is your mind trying to help you change. It figures if it beats you up enough, you'll be more prepared next time, or stop doing those problematic things. The double, the inner critic is a double, edge here though, because, sometimes it does motivate you and push you, but more often than not, it brings you down and so forth. And then the mind is also like this overly helpful friend, right? Who's constantly trying to be so helpful that they end up getting in the way and making things harder. right? So similar to the mind, that overly helpful friend's genuine intention is to help, but it's actually doing the complete opposite. Mind's intention here is to help, but it's going about it in this kind of destructive and oftentimes ineffective manner. And so this is what our minds do naturally, right? And we can't necessarily change the mind's functions, but we don't have to pay the hefty toll of the costs of getting entangled in, these stories that our mind is telling us. And so one strategy that can be useful here is something called the drone's perspective. And so when your mind drone is all the way on the ground, you're just seeing a very small sliver of what's happening. And usually, the smaller the tunnel, the more anxiety, fear, something may be happening in noggin land there. And so the higher, when we fly our drone up a little bit higher, right? So now you're only seeing the floor, you raise it up a little bit higher. Maybe you see yourself sitting in the room, raise it up even higher. You see yourself in the house or the building, even higher. You see your community, you see your town, you see your city, you see your state, you see your country, and so forth. And so the higher that we get, the bigger picture perspective we're able to have, which means the more information we're able to take in. And so, in the face of uncertainty, for example, one's drone is probably really close down to the floor where you're only seeing that, worst case scenario that maybe your mind is telling you will happen. But if we, again, fly it up a little bit higher, you're able to take in more information that can allow for a more balanced perspective or a more accurate perspective, or again, just bigger picture perspective. Same thing with self doubt, right? When your drone's on the floor, you're likely just looking at, what are the things that I've messed up at lately, right? Flying the drone up a little bit higher, what are the things that have been more challenging? And then what are the things that I've been doing well? What are the things that I've been doing great, right? All of this information is there, but when we have more of that kind of tunnel vision and our drone is on the ground, we're going to have less information to work with. So the bigger the picture, the more information you could take in, and the more accurate your perception or perspective will likely be. Another uh, really useful strategy or way to approach navigating the mind is something called diffusion or unhooking. And so emotions often don't respond to, you know, rationale or logic, right? Logically and rationally, you may know, for example, that the harsh self judgments that your mind is making are not true, but it doesn't stop your mind from, telling it to you or even berating you with these judgments. This is kind of a shortcoming with some of the approaches that go in to target those thoughts, right? Like the assumption is that if I can just disprove them or come up with a logical, rational argument, it's somehow going to settle everything. So one path or option you can go down is to come up with a logical counter argument. And that can be a useful thing to have in your toolkit for sure. And there is another way to respond to them. And this is where mindfulness is particularly useful, right? Your mind will keep saying these things to you, but you can learn how to diffuse or unhook from them. And diffusion unhooking is getting separation or space from your thoughts to be able to look at them just as thoughts rather than kind of look through them or take them as absolute truths or facts or battle with them or try to avoid them, but it is acknowledging them and then getting some space and distance to have more of an observer perspective. And so there is a fivefold process for unhooking or diffusion that I like to call NPWA, which is an acronym for Notice, Name, Normalize, Purpose, and Workability. And so in the face of uncertainty, for example, noticing that you're having, an experience of uncertainty and being able to name it. here is anxiety, or I'm noticing, you know, thoughts about, what might happen here, or here is uncertainty, right? So we notice, name it, and then normalize, right? It is completely natural to have these thoughts and feelings. You know, many people in vet med have these thoughts or feelings. This is what makes me similar to others than different. Given the circumstances or the type of work that I'm doing, or this particular case, or just the fact that your patients aren't able to communicate with you directly about what they're experiencing. um, that all of the thoughts, feelings, doubts, anxieties are natural in the circumstances. And then looking at the purpose, right? And so, why does my mind keep telling me this stuff? Right? There is a purpose, with harsh self-judgments, for example, right? There is a purpose to what your mind is dishing out, right? This is your mind trying to help you be a better person, or do things better, or shape up, or deal with things in a more effective way. It's just going about it in a very destructive manner, right? But in knowing and acknowledging that my mind is trying to be helpful here, this can pave the way for an unhooking strategy that I'll be, talking about in a bit, called thanking the mind, right? Like, oh, thanks, mind, for, pointing out to me that I may fail. Thanks for that reminder. And I haven't tried yet, so I don't know that that is the case, right? But again, it's giving you a little bit of distance to be able to choose how you respond. And that's where it goes into the W, which is workability, right? So this is where we are looking at our behavioral responses to the thoughts and feelings that are showing up in the moment, right? So in the face of self-doubt feelings or thoughts, or uncertainty thoughts or feelings, what is the way that you are responding to it, right? And then assessing whether the way you're responding is helping you to move towards building the life that you want, or coping in an effective way, or is it moving you away from coping effectively, or showing up the way that you want to show up, or building the life and career that you want to have, right? And so regardless of whether a thought is, true or not, is less relevant here than when this thought or feeling shows up, how do you respond to it? And is it useful in moving you towards what's important here and being able to, manage it effectively, or is it moving you away from that? And so there are also other types of unhooking diffusion strategies. And again, and so diffusion here, we are not going into battle with our thoughts. We're not contradicting them. We're not challenging them. We're not trying to struggle with them. We're just simply trying to unhook from them, to get some separation or distance, to be able to look at them versus through them. And so, why this is important is, let's say these thoughts, my hands are these thoughts, and you can do this exercise along with me. If your thoughts were your hands, right, slowly start to move them up towards your face. Okay? So this is what it's like when we're hooked or fused to our thoughts. All we see is that thought. And so I don't know about you, but I can't see anything else when I'm, hooked to my thoughts like this. When my hands are in front of my face, I really can't see anything, nor can I take action with my hands like this. But now I invite you to start to slowly lower your hands and just notice what happens, right? So I'm still holding my thoughts here, and I can see everything that's happening in front of me, around me. And so I can take in way more information, and I can take action because my hand, right? And so, you can see, right? If you're hooked to your thoughts, it's really harder to take in a whole bunch of information or really see everything clearly. All you see is what that thought is. And so diffusion strategies help us to lower our thoughts a bit or lower our hands a bit so we can see a bit more because we're not hooked or fused or entangled with our thoughts. And so one strategy is naming the mind, right? So remember, our minds are separate from us and from our brains. And so when your mind is telling you something, you hear it in your own voice, so you take it seriously because it sounds like it's coming from you. And so giving your mind a name can be really useful to help with that separation. In case you're wondering, my mind's name is Ursula. And so, in those, in a moment, like, in moments where your mind is saying, you can't do this, you're going to fail, you know, you're not as competent as your colleagues, rather than, kind of buying into that story, saying, oh, okay, Ursula, I hear you. Thanks for that. Like, ouch, that's kind of harsh, but, thanks for, telling me that story, Ursula. But by referring to who is telling the story, your mind, that's going to help right in that moment create this separation that this isn't you, believing this or having the story. It's something your mind, who is separate from you, is telling you. Can also name the story, right? So, aha, there it is. I'm an imposter, I'm a fraud story. Or there it is, bad things are going to happen story, thanks, mind, right? And so we're just, tuning into what is the story our mind is telling us. And rather than getting entangled and caught up and really enthralled in that story, you're just naming it by its title. What is the theme of this story? And then again, as I had mentioned earlier, you can thank your mind because it is trying to be helpful. And so, you know, another strategy is labeling our inner experiences. So I'm having the thought that, you know, I can't do this. I'm having the thought that I'm a failure, or I'm having the feeling of anxiety, or I'm noticing, feelings of uncertainty. Thank you, mind, right? And this is particularly useful in terms of, the stories and thoughts of like, oh, hey, mind, thanks for that thought. Because again, even though it may be harsh and not helpful in coping more effectively or taking the steps and actions that you want to, it is trying to help. And so we are, giving it that, recognition, that appreciation, and then choosing how we want to respond to it in a way that aligns with what's important. Another thing that you can do is to welcome your thoughts and feelings. As humans, we have a tendency to say, like, no, this is bad, get it away. But again, the more we try to push it down, like a beach ball we're pushing down, the greater, the force that it comes up with. And so, welcoming, those thoughts and feelings like, hey, self-doubt, welcome back. I was expecting you, new haircut, looking good. Or, hey, uncertainty, come on, pulled a seat out for you. You look the same as I saw you 5 minutes ago, right? So we're changing the context of how we're experiencing it, right? Same with repeating thoughts or words, very quickly or very slowly, right? So if I were to repeat self-doubt quickly, self-doubt, 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 right? So, at its core, it's doubt, doubt, right? That is what is giving so much power to what we choose to do next or how we are thinking or perceiving ourselves. And so we're deliteralizing, these thoughts and words a bit by breaking them down to its core, which is just sounds, right? It's harder to take it as seriously. You can also sing your thoughts or say them in a silly voice. Again, we're not trying to demean or belittle our mind here, but this idea of, adding some humor to it to make it a bit lighter, right? To not take it so seriously so that we can unhook and loosen the grip a little bit more. You can also write your thoughts in different colors and fonts to change the context of how you're experiencing it, or write your thought and then turn it into a picture. You can also imagine that your thoughts are train cars and you are on the platform watching the train cars go by. So you're on the platform looking at it versus being on the train car riding those thoughts. Or you can imagine yourself sitting against a tree trunk and there's a river in front of you and there are leaves on that river and you imagine yourself taking each thought, placing it on a leaf and watching it flow slowly downstream, and again getting more and more distance from those thoughts. And so again, there are lots of different types of unhooking or diffusion strategies, and so the invitation is to experiment with them, play around with them, and see which ones resonate most or are most useful. Another thing that or another approach that's helpful in navigating the mind is the four A's of acceptance. And acceptance in this context is what we call experiential acceptance, where you're opening up and making space for all of the inner experiences that are showing up versus trying to kind of like push them away or, avoid them or battle them. And so if you think about a distant relative, right? Who, for one reason or another, there are certain mannerisms about them that get under your skin. And all of a sudden you hear knock, knock, knock on the door, and you look outside, it is that distant relative. You weren't expecting them, but yet here they are. So you acknowledge that they're there, right? You then allow them to come in. Hey, wasn't expecting you, but here you are, so come on in. And then you may say, hey, why don't you have a seat on the couch? Are you thirsty? Can I get you, a glass of water? Would you like a snack? Are you hungry? So you accommodate them and then you appreciate them and appreciate in the sense that, certain things that you don't like about them, but there are, things that now you spent a little bit of time with this person, you realize are a little bit more redeeming or endearing. Right? And so if we were to apply this to, thoughts or feelings, right? First thing to do, acknowledge, hey, this feeling is there. This thought is there, right? And then allow that feeling to be there. Notice where it's showing up on your body, right? And then we accommodate. Take a deep breath in, into where you feel that emotion or sensation, breathing in, opening up space around it, kind of giving a cushion for that feeling to be there in that space. As you exhale, allowing yourself to kind of loosen up your body a bit, right? So you're allowing and now we're accommodating. We're making space for that feeling to be there. And then the last part, appreciate. It's not saying like, "Oh my gosh, I am so glad that, this self-doubt is here or this anxiety is here." What we're saying in terms of appreciating is appreciating the feeling or thought for the information that it has to give you, right? And so our feelings can communicate to us what we have going on, right? It can illuminate and communicate what we have going on and what we might need in the face of what's happening. It can illuminate to us, what is important, because again, our pain and our values are flip side of the same coin, right? It can also motivate us to, take action in ways to, meet our needs based off of what we're feeling, or take action towards something that is important, based off of what this information is. And so our feelings are kind of like reporters for our soul. And if we open up and ask ourselves, if this feeling could speak, what would it be trying to tell me? Or this thought, what is my mind's purpose for having this thought? That is going to give you information that can help you then, know or choose what steps or actions to take next. Another thing that can be useful in the face of emotional storms or mind nados that might be spinning is something called the ACE formula for dropping anchor. And remember, and so dropping anchor isn't going to stop a storm, But just like if your boat was, in the harbor, during a storm, you drop anchor to keep it from getting swept away, right? And so we can drop anchor ourselves in the face of these emotional storms or tornadoes to be able to keep ourselves steady until the storm passes. And so the A stands for acknowledge, the difficult thoughts and feelings that are coming up in a non-judgmental, kind, or curious manner, right? So here is, uncertainty, or I'm noticing, thoughts that I'm not good enough, right? And while you're acknowledging those thoughts and feelings, C stands for connect with your body, right? You may not have control over your thoughts and feelings, but you do have control over your actions. So while you're acknowledging your thoughts and feelings, you can, press your hands together, push your feet into the floor, push your hands onto your legs, move your neck around, loosen up your shoulders a bit. Any kind of action that you can take, right? You're moving from naming what's happening in your mind to now moving into your body where you do have control. And then while doing all of that, the next step is E, engage in the world around you or what you're doing. Right? And so the invitation here is to focus your attention on whatever aspect or moments of your present world are important and matter to you. Right? So this could be the thoughts and feelings that are coming up, or it could be, being present in the environment that you're in. And so this is where you can look around you and notice, a couple of things that you hear, notice a few things that you see in front of you, right? But we're acknowledging the thoughts and feelings that are coming up while connecting with our body and then engaging or re-engaging in what's in front of you. And so, when it comes to navigating the mind, mindfulness, and so this present moment awareness without judgment and with openness and curiosity, plus acceptance, right? Being open and allowing these inner experiences to be there, and diffusion, right? Getting separation or distance from our thoughts, plus value driven action. So taking steps and actions that align with what's important, that equals what we call psychological flexibility, right? Being, aware of what, is happening, within us, being open to these experiences, and, then being engaged, taking action towards, the people, places, or things that are important to you. And so moving on to the next, approach that can be really useful in the face of self-doubt and uncertainty is self-compassion, or a user-friendly term that I prefer is holding yourself kindly. And so we are going to do another exercise. So I want you to imagine that you are about to learn a new, complicated, and demanding skill. So you enlist the assistance of two coaches with different approaches, both of whom will get you the same results. Coach A is tough, harsh, focuses on everything that you do wrong, gets easily irritated, constantly points out your mistakes, and tries to make you feel about what you're doing. And she does so using a cold and harsh tone of voice. Even though she keeps you moving, it feels like she's sometimes being cruel. Coach B is warm, gentle, accepting, and understanding. She will help you set goals and push you toward them, but she does so in a supportive and motivating manner, right? She looks for your strengths, celebrates your successes, and encourages you to take pride in your accomplishments. When times get tough, Coach B will listen to you and will also remind you of your skills and strengths to keep you motivated. So, remembering that both coaches get you the same results, which coach do you choose? Coach A or Coach B? If you are like the many, many other people who I've done this exercise with, you may have chosen Coach B, right? That seems kind of like a no-brainer, right? Based off of how she was described. Now, if I were to ask you, which coach do you show up as for yourself? Which coach would that be? And again, if you are like many of the other veterinarians that I've done this exercise with, you probably answered with Coach A, right? So if we had a choice, we would choose Coach B, right? But most people, you know, tend to show up, with themselves as Coach A. Right? And there are many reasons for this. The most common reasons are these myths or objections that, and the myths are like the ways that we've been kind of conditioned or pre-programmed by society to understand it, and then the objections that our mind makes. So, one very common one is that being self-critical is motivating and helps me perform better. When the fact there is that self-criticism is actually very demoralizing, overwhelming, and, most dangerously, it skews our perception of ourselves. Right? Other kind of myths or objections are that self-compassion means I'm letting myself off the hook, when the truth there is that self-compassion can involve and does involve at times, constructive feedback and discernment when warranted. I also hear oftentimes people, say that self-compassion is self-indulging, when, self-compassion means being gentle, supportive, caring, accepting, and understanding with yourself, in moments of struggle, pain, and failure, just like you would, for anybody else, right? And so Kristen Neff, says it so beautifully. She says, we don't give, ourselves compassion to feel better, but we give ourselves compassion because we feel bad, right? And so self compassion can also look like having the courage to set boundaries, to have difficult conversations, right? Express how you feel, to seek help, and to stand up for your well being. So, self compassion has three pillars. One is mindfulness, and that is observing thoughts and feelings in the present moment with curiosity and openness without minimizing, amplifying, avoiding, battling, or judging those thoughts, right? So, what this might sound like is I can't believe I asked my colleague this question that I should have known the answer to. Now they think I'm stupid and I feel like such an imposter, right? So, it would sound like I'm noticing I'm being hard on myself right now. Or here is an imposter thought, right? The another pillar is common humanity versus the flip side would be isolation. And so as humans, we're conditioned to be happy and to put on masks. And that can come with a hefty cost, right? Feeling alone and isolated. And so the invitation here is to connect with, or, to connect to this shared humanness. Realize that, everyone struggles with pain, flaws, and mistakes, right? It's without knowing anybody who is watching this webinar, I can guarantee that you've experienced problems in your life. The reason I know this is because you have a pulse, right? If you are a pulse and you have a human and you have it, if you have a pulse and you are a human, there are going to be challenges, problems, issues that arise, right? That is just a feature of being human, because we are a flawed species. It's what we all have in common. And so, what this could sound like, in action is, saying to yourself, I'm not the only person in this field who has ever felt this way. Everyone asks questions, is critical of themselves, and feels like an imposter at some point in time, right? I don't know everything there is to be known in vet med or have all the answers, but neither do others. And then the last pillar is self kindness versus self judgment or criticism. And so this is a way of relating to yourself with kindness and unconditional acceptance. And acceptance in this context doesn't mean that you agree with it, you approve of it, or even that you're okay with it. You're just acknowledging that this is the reality of how it is, and that if it could be different, it would be different. And so in the short term, when we accept, it can be a bit, painful, but in the long term, there's peace versus when we, don't have that kind of, acceptance, then it's pain in the short term and suffering in the long term. And so, uh, this, unconditional acceptance, it's also, and the most important piece of this is relating to yourself with this kindness and acceptance, especially in times of failure or when you feel inadequate. Because again, that's when, we need it the most, not because we want to feel better, but because we feel bad. And so, what this can sound like is, may I try to be patient, and gentle with myself because I value learning and want to be a competent vet and provide the best care possible. So even though I feel vulnerable right now, I appreciate that I had the courage to ask the question and an opportunity to grow. Right? And so mindfulness and self-compassion, kind of like two wings of the same bird, right? Mindfulness asks, what am I experiencing right now? And self-compassion asks, what do I need right now in the face of what I'm experiencing? And so coach A, which represents, that mean, harsh, inner critic, it ultimately undermines motivation, it skews self perception, it creates fear of failure, and it zaps confidence, right? So it doesn't really have a ton of utility here. Now, Coach B, on the other hand, demonstrates that it is possible, to be kind while working hard towards your goals. You can hold yourself accountable, you know, for challenges encountered and for achieving successes, and do both with warmth, kindness, and understanding. Right? The best part is that this kind of compassionate feedback improves performance, confidence, and self-esteem. It's energizing and motivating. It boosts resilience and provides the, emotional safety needed to keep trying even when things, don't go as planned. It's an antidote for perfectionism, harsh feedback, from yourselves, peers, supervisors, antidote to self-doubt, critical self-talk, and so much more that is in your control. Right? So, one way to show up, or to hold yourself kindly is to offer yourself kind words. What would you say to a peer or someone you care about? And say that to yourself. Be mindful of the tone that you're using because you want it to be a warm inner tone. Okay. And, these kind words, please know that this is not a positive thinking strategy in any way, shape, or form. It's essentially saying, that this is really difficult right now. How can I comfort and care for myself in this moment? Right. And so the mindfulness piece is acknowledging the pain, struggle, difficulty. The self-compassion piece is responding to that in a kind, caring, supportive, understanding, warm, and gentle way. Can also offer yourself kind gestures, like gently massaging an area that is tightened up or feels painful, placing a hand over your heart or another area of your body where you're feeling that emotional or physical pain. You can take some slow, deep breaths and imagine, this warmth and comfort and soothing that's flowing through your hands, and into the body. You can give yourself a hug. And then also offering yourself kind acts or deeds. This could be any act of self-care, could be setting boundaries, giving yourself permission to learn and grow, trying again when things don't go as expected, giving 100% of yourself at that moment while not expecting perfection, asking for help when needed, loosening the grip on what's out of your control, celebrating and acknowledging progress, accomplishments, and even small victories. These are just some examples of the many, many ways to show up for yourself in a kind, caring, supportive, understanding, and accepting way. And so, another way, or another really useful, powerful antidote to self-doubt in particular, is something called the growth mindset. And so, The idea here is that nobody knows everything and never will, right? And so the growth mindset transforms the meaning of effort and difficulty, right? Difficulty essentially equals not yet and is a learning opportunity versus a failure. And so this is really tapping into the power of yet, the word yet. Right? You don't have to know everything yet. You don't have to know everything right now in this moment. And, to get to where you are as veterinarians, hey, this may be a little bit unfamiliar because you've essentially been overachieving all of your life to get to where you are. And so, this, while it may feel unfamiliar and uncomfortable, right, this is an opportunity to liberate yourself from, this fixed mindset that can be very limiting. Right? And so the fixed mindset is characterized by a desire to look smart, whereas the growth mindset is characterized by a desire to learn, right? With a fixed mindset, there's more of a tendency to believe that intelligence and talent are innate and static, that some people are naturally good at things and others are not, right? Maybe she's born with it, maybe it's Maybelline. But that, you either have it from birth or you don't have it at all. And there's a tendency to believe that, one is not in control of their abilities. Whereas with a growth mindset, there's a tendency to believe that intelligence and talent can be developed and that you do have the capacity and control, to learn and grow your skills, right? Tendency to believe that people who are good at something are good at it because they built that ability and that, you are in control of your abilities, right? With a fixed mindset, there's a tendency to avoid challenges, give up easily, view effort as fruitless and something, you only do when you're not that good at it, right? More of a tendency to become defensive, or ignore or refuse useful criticism or feedback, a tendency to focus on proving oneself, right? An inability to accept mistakes or failures, right? Failure is something that is shameful and should be avoided, right? There's this tendency to shy away from unfamiliar things and to feel threatened by other successes. On the other hand, with a growth mindset, there is a tendency to view challenges as opportunities, to persist in the face of setbacks. Effort is seen as the pathway to mastery versus something that is, fruitless. A tendency to appreciate and incorporate constructive feedback, right? To see it as learning experiences or shared learning, and learn and grow from mistakes or failures, right? So a failure is a valuable lesson, and mistakes are opportunities to improve, right? There's also a tendency to, more of a tendency or willingness to step outside of one's comfort zone, to be inspired by the success of others, to focus on the process of getting better and not just the end result. And so with the growth mindset, there are a couple of invitations here. One is to tap into something that I like to call hindsight versus hindsight. And so hindsight says you should have known what was going to happen before it happened. Hindsight says, based off of what you just experienced, what did you learn from it that you can incorporate or implement next time? So it really, kind of fosters this learning opportunity where a mistake isn't, a life sentence. It is an opportunity to say, now that I've been through this, what did I learn that I want to remember next time? There's also an invitation here to focus on the process versus the outcome. A lot of the times the outcomes are out of our control, but what we can control is how we choose to show up at every step along the way and be able to focus on the process of things, the pathway to and towards, not just the end result or the outcome. And the last invitation is to kind of give yourself a few kind of questions or prompts, that you ask yourself at the end of the day, rather than kind of thrown on the floor only looking at what did I mess up today? What did I do wrong? Things like that. When you leave, asking yourself, what are some things that I already knew today? Right? What's something that I learned? Because again, I am not born knowing everything that there is to be known. And so I anticipate that I'll have lots of learning opportunities. You know, Asking yourself, what was a challenge that can now be a learning opportunity? Where's somewhere that, you got stuck that you now have a sense of, okay, there's more to be learned here. And you now know what you may need to, strengthen or improve in that area. Right? Asking yourself, what did you appreciate about yourself? What did you appreciate about how you showed up in that day? Or what did you appreciate about how the way you showed up in the face of a challenge or doubt? Right? But again, looking at, what are some things about yourself and the way you showed up or how you navigated things that you appreciate. And so these questions are essentially going to help to fly that drone up a bit higher to give yourself bigger picture of all of the pieces that may have unfolded in, that day. And so you can have a more, kind of bigger and accurate perception of yourself and how you, showed up and your skills and your performance. Well, so here are just some resources. The Happiness Trap has a lot of resources, handouts, exercises related to unhooking and some other uh, um, experiential acceptance and some other concepts and strategies and tools from acceptance and commitment therapy. There's a selfcompassion.org website. Insight Timer is a free mindfulness app. Books on ACT, podcasts, the NOMV YouTube channel. And so, in closing, while varying levels of uncertainty and self-doubt are inevitable in vet med, struggling and suffering with these experiences can be a choice, right? In the face of these common experiences, hopefully your toolbox is now a bit fuller, with other options for responding to your mind in ways that are more adaptive and useful for coping effectively with self-doubt and uncertainty. So, thank you for taking the time to learn about ways to manage self doubt and uncertainty. And I am wishing you many mindful and unhooked moments, along with double doses of holding yourself kindly and permission to tap into the growth mindset's power of yet. Again, thank you for tuning in and take care. Bye.